With that, I want to yield to freshman member who's already making big splash here, getting a lot done in Washington, working especially on a bipartisan basis on a lot of these issues, getting some good things done. The gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Lipinski, I appreciate those kind words, but I think you and I know best that we had good teachers to help us understand what it takes to get things done here in the United States Congress, and most importantly, that's the ability to work together. And so I am proud to stand here today with all of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, who are on the Climate Solutions Caucus. As you've heard tonight, and as we know, the Climate Solutions Caucus is a bipartisan caucus that gives Democrats and Republicans the opportunity to sit down and to discuss ways not only to protect our environment, but to protect our homes, our nation's economy, and our nation's security. Yes, this caucus consists of people from separate political parties, but all of us are united in our belief that we must have this dialogue to defend our future. Now, being from the Central Coast of California, where we have over 120 miles of stunning coastline in my district, we understand the vulnerability that comes with rising sea levels, something that can impact our economy, our security, and of course, our daily lives. Now, the co-chairs of the Climate Solutions Caucus, Florida Representatives Carlos Curbelo and Mr. Deutsch, Ted Deutsch, they understand and they appreciate that threat. For earlier this year, Florida was pummeled by Hurricane Irma and the subsequent severe flooding, a storm that affected the lives of millions of Americans and cost billions in recovery and cleanup efforts. We have seen that at times of crisis like that, despite the damage and despite our differences, our government and even this Congress can come together and put back together those communities. That is our government during an emergency. And at times where there's storms, where there's damage, we are motivated to come together and govern. Now, this year, my district saw this type of governing due to damage it suffered during the major winter storms earlier in 2017. Every county in my district saw devastation. One county in particular, Monterey County, suffered an extreme amount of damage. The town of Big Sur, along the coast of California in particular. The northern route of Highway 1 going into Big Sur suffered a knockout of a major bridge. The southern route had a major landslide, leaving that community isolated. But I can tell you 2 weeks ago, I stood on the brand new bridge that was built. And as I was standing there, to me, it was the story of the people of Big Sur. Very resilient, always coming back from these types of situations. But it was also the story of government working. People and government coming together, getting things done to help people. Now, just prior to that, I had read a New York Times editorial where the title of that editorial was, "We Used to Build Things." And it was by David Brooks, and he talked about this big fire called the Big Burn back in the early 1900s that started in Washington and Oregon and spread throughout the upper West, all the way into Montana. And from that devastating fire arose something, and that was the U.S. Forest Service. And when I read that article, it reminded me that throughout the history of this nation, we have always built things to help people. We have engineered infrastructure to energize our economy, and we have expanded agencies to embolden and to empower our communities and the people who live there. So now, after the storms on the West Coast, after the flooding on the Midwest, and after the hurricanes on the East Coast, it is our turn. It is time for this generation, our generation, to build things in a smart and resilient fashion so that future generations are secure and safe in their homes and in their communities. And we need to start by focusing on and building infrastructure that is strong and stable to sustain the inevitable intense storms of the future. Now, we know, and what has been confirmed by the Nonpartisan Federal Government Accountability Office, that extreme weather events are already costing U.S. taxpayers billions and billions of dollars each year. According to that GAO report, the federal government spent more than $350 billion the last decade on losses to private property and disaster assistance programs from natural disasters. Now, that amount doesn't even include the massive price tag on the recovery efforts from this year's hurricanes and fires that are expected to be amongst the costliest in our nation's history. And we know that it's going to get worse as storms are more intense and recovery efforts are going to cost more. So we need to recognize and we need to realize the need for smart rebuilding. Now, after the 2012 hurricane up in New York, Hurricane Sandy, there was a rebuilding task force that was put together. And it recommended that federal flood protection measures should entail that projects receiving federal dollars, they should comply with elevation and flood proofing measures to avoid rebuilding them after future storms. The report wanted to ensure that we do not need to pay multiple times to repair for flooding damages in flood-impacted areas. And in 2015, the administration put forward the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. That was a standard that set out that federally financed infrastructure projects must be built to withstand future storms and flooding. That standard was meant to ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and communities are protected. However, in August, this administration decided to roll back the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, a decision that was compounded by its poor timing, as it was announced 2 weeks before the hurricanes that ripped apart Houston, Florida, and Puerto Rico. So last month, Congressman Curbelo and I introduced the Federal Infrastructure Flood Resiliency Act, a bipartisan bill that ensures that federal agencies complete implementation of a federal flood risk management standard. Such a standard that will not just benefit our coastal communities, it will help our government and it will help our country, because we know that every dollar that's invested in flood mitigation efforts results in $4 in saved flood recovery cost. This is something that Republicans and Democrats understand. After Hurricane Harvey, the governor of Texas, Mr. Abbott, he stated, as we go through and build in the build-out phase and rebuild Texas, part of our focus must be on rebuilding in a way that will prevent a disaster like this from happening again. Mr. Speaker, by investing in more resilient project designs, our communities will be able to recover quickly and they will be protected against any future flooding. Taking these prudent steps will save taxpayer dollars and prevent future loss of life and property. It is a common sense step that we can take toward responsible bipartisanship governing. And it's this type of governing that needs to happen all the time. Now, when I stood on that bridge, and I was there celebrating the reopening of that bridge, the reopening to Big Sur, I also thought that this was government at its best, where the government came together. It responded, it reacted in record fashion, and it reconstructed a major bridge. So yes, it made me proud. But it also made me realize that we need to stop just governing by crisis. We need to start governing with leadership. We need to come together to get things done, not just in emergency situations, not just for natural disasters of today, but we need to start governing for tomorrow. The Climate Solutions Caucus understands and believes that we in Congress need to lead. We need to do that by coming together. We do that by talking about the effects of climate change. We do that with flood risk management standard legislation. And we don't necessarily do it for us. We do it for our children. That is leadership, and that is why I am proud to be on the Climate Solutions Caucus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.